Behind the dusty trails and heroic gunfights of this Western classic lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets that would make even the most seasoned movie buff do a double take. From elaborate car crash schemes to stolen movie props, feuding superstars, and a script written mere hours before filming, the making of this iconic film was as chaotic and unpredictable as the Wild West itself. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about The Magnificent Seven 1960. Fact 1. Steve McQueen faked a car crash to get cast. Steve McQueen deliberately crashed his rental car into a bank building and wore a fake neck brace to get out of his TV contract, allowing him to appear in The Magnificent Seven during his supposed recovery period. In 1959, Steve McQueen was riding high as the star of the popular television Western series Wanted, Dead or Alive, but he had bigger dreams than the small screen could offer. When director John Sturges approached him about starring in The Magnificent Seven alongside established movie star Yul Brynner, McQueen saw it as his golden ticket to Hollywood stardom. There was just one massive problem standing in his way: Dick Powell, the head of 4-Star Productions, who controlled McQueen's television contract and absolutely refused to let him go. McQueen knew that appearing in The Magnificent Seven could transform his career from television actor to movie star, so he was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to make it happen. After consulting with his agent, McQueen hatched an elaborate and dangerous plan that would have made his fictional bounty hunter character proud. The scheme was as simple as it was risky: fake a serious injury that would prevent him from fulfilling his television obligations. McQueen, who was an experienced race car driver in real life, deliberately drove his rental Cadillac into the side of the Bank of Boston while he was on vacation in the city. The crash was carefully calculated to cause enough damage to be believable without seriously injuring himself, though the stunt was still incredibly dangerous. After the staged accident, McQueen emerged from the wreckage claiming to have suffered severe whiplash injuries that required him to wear a neck brace and take extended time off from work. The performance was so convincing that 4-Star Productions had no choice but to grant him medical leave from Wanted, Dead or Alive. During his supposed recuperation period, McQueen was free to travel to Mexico and film The Magnificent Seven. His first wife, Niall Adams, later confirmed the entire story, revealing that McQueen had literally crashed his way into movie history. The gamble paid off spectacularly, as The Magnificent Seven became McQueen's breakthrough film role and launched him toward becoming one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Fact 2. Yul Brynner got married on set using movie props. Yul Brynner married his second wife, Chilean model Doris Kleiner, right on the set of The Magnificent Seven during filming in 1960, and the wedding celebration made creative use of many of the same decorations and props that had been prepared for the movie's fiesta scene. While most actors try to keep their personal lives separate from their work, Brynner decided to blend the two in the most romantic way possible during the production of The Magnificent Seven. Doris Kleiner, whose name is pronounced Kleiner, was a stunning Chilean model who had captured the heart of the already famous actor. Rather than wait until filming wrapped or fly back to Hollywood for a traditional ceremony, Brynner chose to turn the movie set in Cuernavaca, Mexico, into his wedding venue. The timing worked out perfectly, because the film's production designers had already created elaborate decorations for a festive village celebration scene that appears in the movie. Instead of letting all those beautiful props and decorations go to waste between filming days, Brynner and the production team repurposed them for his real-life wedding celebration. The colorful banners, flowers, and festive arrangements that were meant to represent a joyous Mexican village fiesta became the backdrop for Brynner's actual marriage ceremony. The wedding photos from that day show the happy couple surrounded by the same vibrant decorations that movie audiences would later see on screen during the film's party scenes. Cast members and crew served as wedding guests, creating an unusual situation where Brynner's co-stars, including Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, and the rest of the Magnificent Seven, were present to witness his marriage ceremony. Brynner and Doris remained married from 1960 to 1967, and they had one child together, a daughter named Victoria Brynner, whose godmother was the famous actress Audrey Hepburn. The marriage began with this unique celebration that perfectly captured the blending of Brenner's professional and personal life during one of the most important film projects of his career. Fact 3. The script was written hours before filming. The script for The Magnificent Seven was often written at night for scenes that would be shot the very next morning, creating a chaotic production environment where actors sometimes received their dialogue just hours before filming began. The screenplay troubles for The Magnificent Seven started long before cameras began rolling and continued throughout the entire production process. The project had already gone through multiple writers, with Walter Bernstein creating the original adaptation of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, only to have his work completely reworked by Walter Newman. When Newman's version became the shooting script, the problems were far from over, because the screenplay required constant changes and updates during filming. The situation became even more complicated when Walter Newman was unavailable to handle the frequent rewrites that director John Sturges needed during production. This meant that writer William Roberts was brought in to take over the rewriting duties while filming was already underway in Mexico. Roberts found himself in the unusual position of having to create new dialogue and scene adjustments on an almost daily basis to keep the production moving forward. The pressure was so intense that Roberts and the production team often worked through the night, writing and revising scenes that the actors would perform the following morning. This created a frantic atmosphere where cast members would arrive on set and receive freshly typed script pages for scenes they were about to film. The actors had little time to study their lines or prepare their performances, which added an element of spontaneity to the filming process that was both exciting and nerve-wracking. This last-minute writing approach explains why some scenes in the final film feel more improvised than others, and why certain character interactions have a natural, unpolished quality. The screenplay credit situation became so tangled that when it was suggested Roberts should share credit with Newman, Newman became so angry that he demanded his name be removed from the project entirely. As a result, William Roberts ended up receiving full screenplay credit for a script he had mainly edited and rewritten during production. Fact 4. Director killed characters in order of casting. Director John Sturges chose to kill off the 7 gunfighters in the exact order they had been cast for the film, creating an unintentional meta-narrative that connected the real-world production process with the fictional story. When Sturges was planning which characters would die during the climactic battle sequences of The Magnificent Seven, he faced a unique challenge that most directors don't encounter. The original script mentioned which of the 7 would be killed but didn't specify the order of their deaths or exactly how the battle would unfold, since the action sequences hadn't been fully choreographed yet. This gave Sturges complete creative freedom to decide who would survive and who would make the ultimate sacrifice. Rather than making these decisions based on dramatic effect or character development, Sturges came up with an unusual system that reflected the behind-the-scenes reality of how the movie came together. He decided that the gunfighters would die in the exact same order that the actors had been hired for their roles, starting with the first actor cast and ending with the last one brought onto the project. This meant that the characters' fates were determined not by their importance to the story or their relationships with other characters, but by the practical timeline of when each actor signed their contract. The first actors to join the production would see their characters fall first in battle, while those who were cast later in the process would survive longer into the final confrontation. This casting order death sequence created an accidentally poetic connection between the real-world process of assembling the cast and the fictional narrative of the story. In a strange way, it meant that the actors who had been with the project the longest were the first to complete their journey, both in terms of filming their death scenes and in terms of their characters' story arcs. The decision also reflected the practical pressures that Sturges was facing during production, where he needed to make quick choices about complex action sequences while managing a large cast and dealing with the various ego conflicts and scheduling challenges that were happening on set. Fact 5. Eli Wallach used Marlon Brando's stolen saddle. Eli Wallach rode a distinctive silver-trimmed saddle as the villain Calvera in The Magnificent Seven. But this wasn't just any ordinary movie prop. It was the exact same saddle that Marlon Brando had used in his Western film One-Eyed Jacks, which had been completed just before The Magnificent Seven went into production. Hollywood studios in 1960 were much more practical about reusing expensive props and costumes than they are today, especially when it came to elaborate Western gear that could cost hundreds of dollars to create. The silver-trimmed saddle that Brando had used in One-Eyed Jacks was particularly ornate and expensive, featuring detailed metalwork and craftsmanship that made it perfect for a wealthy bandit leader like Calvera. Rather than letting this beautiful piece of equipment sit unused in a studio warehouse, the prop department decided to give it a second life in The Magnificent Seven. Wallach himself was deeply involved in choosing his character's costume and accessories, because he wanted to show what a successful bandit would do with all the loot he had stolen over the years. The actor believed that Calvera would display his wealth through expensive clothing, jewelry, and riding equipment, so the ornate saddle fit perfectly with his vision of the character. The silver trim and decorative elements suggested that Calvera had either stolen the saddle from a wealthy victim or had it specially made with his ill-gotten gains. The connection between the two films goes beyond just shared props, since both One-Eyed Jacks and The Magnificent Seven were westerns that featured complex anti-heroes rather than traditional good versus evil storylines. Brando had actually directed One-Eyed Jacks himself, making it his only film as a director, while The Magnificent Seven was an adaptation of a Japanese samurai film. The saddle thus became a small but tangible link between two very different approaches to the Western genre, during a time when Hollywood was experimenting with more sophisticated and morally ambiguous cowboy stories. Fact 6. McQueen sabotaged Brenner's height tricks. Yul Brynner would secretly build small dirt mounds to stand on during scenes with Steve McQueen, so he would appear taller than his co-star. But McQueen discovered this trick and would surreptitiously kick the dirt away whenever he walked past Brynner between takes. The height competition between Brynner and McQueen became one of the most petty and amusing aspects of their famous feud during the filming of The Magnificent Seven. Brynner, who was already an established movie star thanks to films like The King and I and The Ten Commandments, was sensitive about his height and wanted to maintain his commanding presence on screen. McQueen, on the other hand, was the up-and-coming television actor who was determined to steal scenes and establish himself as Brynner's equal in every way possible. Brynner's solution was surprisingly low-tech but effective. He would carefully build up little mounds of earth with his feet while the cameras weren't rolling, creating a small platform that would give him a few extra inches of height when standing next to McQueen. This technique is actually a common trick used by shorter actors in Hollywood, and when done properly, it's nearly invisible to both the camera and the audience. The extra height would make Brynner appear more dominant and authoritative in their shared scene. However, McQueen was observant enough to notice what Brynner was doing, and he decided to turn it into a game of cat and mouse that went on throughout the entire production. Whenever McQueen had to walk past Brynner's position between takes or during scene setup, he would casually kick at the dirt mound with his foot, scattering the carefully constructed platform, and forcing Brynner to start over again. This created an ongoing cycle where Brynner would patiently rebuild his height advantage only to have McQueen destroy it moments later with a seemingly accidental kick. The crew members who witnessed this behavior found it both childish and hilarious, as two grown men who were supposed to be professional actors were essentially playing an elaborate practical joke on each other throughout the filming process. Fact 7. An assistant was hired to count hat touches. Yul Brynner became so paranoid about Steve McQueen stealing scenes that he hired a personal assistant whose specific job was to count how many times McQueen touched his hat during Brynner's dialogue, treating it like a scientific study of scene-stealing behavior. The feud between Brynner and McQueen had escalated to such an absurd level that Brynner was no longer content to simply complain about his co-star's attention-grabbing antics. He decided he needed concrete evidence of what McQueen was doing, so he could present his case to director John Sturges with actual numbers and facts. McQueen had developed a habit of fidgeting with his hat, adjusting it, tipping it, or touching the brim whenever Brenner was delivering important lines. And Brenner was convinced this was a deliberate strategy to draw the audience's eyes away from him. The assistant that Brenner hired was given the unusual task of standing just out of camera range during filming and keeping a careful tally of every single time McQueen's hands went to his hat while Brenner was speaking. This person would watch each take with the intensity of a sports statistician, marking down each hat touch on a notepad and presumably providing Brenner with detailed reports at the end of each filming day. According to accounts from people who witnessed this bizarre arrangement, the assistant took the job very seriously and would sometimes be seen scribbling notes frantically during scenes where McQueen was particularly active with his hat movements. The whole situation created an atmosphere where a simple piece of cowboy wardrobe became the center of a psychological warfare campaign between two major actors. This hat-counting operation represents perhaps the most extreme example of how petty and obsessive the competition between Brenner and McQueen had become during the production. While most actors might simply ask the director to speak with a problematic co-star, Brenner chose to document the perceived offenses with mathematical precision, as if he were building a legal case rather than trying to solve a creative disagreement between professionals. Fact 8. Real bandits adopted Eli Wallach as family. The Mexican extras who were hired to play bandits in Calvera's gang became so genuinely attached to Eli Wallach that they adopted him as one of their own, insisting on personally checking his horse tack and prop gun before every scene and serving as his unofficial bodyguards throughout the filming. Director John Sturges had made the decision to hire actual local men to play the members of Calvera's bandit gang because he wanted their performances to look as authentic as possible. These weren't professional actors, but rather real cowboys and horsemen from the area around Cuernavaca, Mexico, where the film was being shot. Wallach, who was a classically trained stage actor from New York, was initially concerned about how he would fit in with this group of genuine Mexican horsemen who had probably never worked with Hollywood actors before. What happened instead was one of the most heartwarming relationships to develop during the chaotic production of The Magnificent Seven. The local men who played his gang members quickly grew fond of Wallach and began treating him like a beloved family member, rather than just another actor they were working with. Every morning before filming began, after Wallach had gotten into his elaborate bandit costume, the group would take him out for horseback rides that lasted about an hour, teaching him how to ride and handle his horse like a real bandit leader. The men took their protective role so seriously that they refused to let Wallach use any equipment that they hadn't personally inspected first. Before each scene, members of his bandit gang would carefully examine his horse's saddle, bridle, and other tack to make sure everything was properly secured and safe. They would also check his prop guns and weapons to ensure they were in working order and wouldn't malfunction during filming. This protective behavior extended beyond just the technical aspects of filming, as the Mexican actors also served as Wallach's unofficial bodyguards, accompanying him and his wife, actress Ann Jackson, around the location and making sure they were safe and comfortable during their time in Mexico. Fact 9. The cast was assembled to beat a strike deadline. The entire seven-man cast of The Magnificent Seven had to be finalized by noon on a specific Friday in early 1960 to avoid being completely shut down by an impending Screen Actors Guild strike that would have prevented any new actors from being hired for the production. The Screen Actors Guild strike was scheduled to begin on March 7, 1960, and would run until April 18th of that same year. This created an enormous problem for director John Sturges and the producers because they were still missing several key members of their seven-man ensemble cast as the deadline approached. According to the union rules, unless the casting for a picture was completed by noon on the Friday before the strike began, the production couldn't start filming until after the strike ended, which would have delayed the movie by more than a month. Actor Robert Vaughn later recalled the intense pressure that everyone involved with the project felt as that Friday deadline approached, describing it as a frantic rush to get 7 actors signed and contracted before the window of opportunity slammed shut. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a movie about assembling 7 gunfighters was facing a real-life deadline to actually assemble 7 actors, with the entire future of the project hanging in the balance. The casting team was working around the clock during those final days, making phone calls, negotiating contracts, and trying to convince actors to commit to the project before they ran out of time. Some of the actors who were eventually cast, including James Coburn, were brought in at the very last minute through personal connections and recommendations from other cast members who were already on board. Sturges and his team managed to complete their casting just barely in time, signing the final contracts with only hours to spare before the noon deadline. The successful completion of casting allowed filming to begin on schedule in Mexico, but the rushed nature of the process meant that some of the actors had very little time to prepare for their roles or even meet their co-stars before filming commenced. Fact 10. Mexican censors demanded spotless farmer clothes. Mexican government censors insisted that the poor farmers in the village wear perfectly clean and spotless clothing in every single scene, despite the fact that these characters were supposed to be dirt-poor agricultural workers who had been terrorized and robbed by bandits for years. Since The Magnificent Seven was being filmed in Mexico with significant Mexican government cooperation, the production had to work closely with local censors, who reviewed the script and monitored the filming to ensure that Mexico and its people were portrayed in the most positive light possible. The censors were particularly sensitive about how Mexican characters would appear on screen, since this was a major Hollywood production that would be seen by audiences around the world. The farmers in the story were meant to be desperately poor villagers who worked in the fields all day and had been repeatedly victimized by Calvera's bandit gang, which had stolen their food, money, and crops for years. Realistically, these characters would have worn out, patched, and dirty clothing that reflected their difficult circumstances and their daily labor in the soil. However, the Mexican censors felt that showing farmers in dirty or ragged clothes would create a negative impression of Mexican agricultural workers and rural communities. This created a significant challenge for the costume department, which had to make the farmers look authentically poor and desperate, while also keeping their clothes unrealistically clean and well-maintained. The censors made numerous other requests throughout the production to ensure that the Mexican characters and locations were presented in ways that would not embarrass the country or reinforce negative stereotypes about Mexico. The original script had also followed the plot of Seven Samurai more closely, with the farmers leaving their village to search for mercenaries to hire, but the censors objected to this because they felt it made the farmers appear too weak and helpless. As a result, the script was changed so that the farmers initially tried to buy guns to defend themselves, showing more initiative and self-reliance before ultimately deciding to hire the 7 gunfighters. Fact 11. James Coburn saw Seven Samurai 15 times. James Coburn was such a devoted fanatic of Akira Kurosawa's original film Seven Samurai that he had watched it 15 times before being cast in The Magnificent Seven, and he specifically got to play the American version of his favorite character from the Japanese masterpiece. Coburn's obsession with Seven Samurai went far beyond casual movie appreciation. He had studied the film with the intensity of a film school student, watching it over and over again to analyze the performances, the cinematography, and the character development. This level of dedication was unusual even for actors, since Seven Samurai was a 3.5-hour Japanese film with subtitles that wasn't easily accessible to American audiences in the late 1950s. Most people who saw foreign films at that time watched them once in art house theaters. But Coburn had somehow managed to see multiple screenings or had access to a print that he could watch repeatedly. When Coburn learned that Hollywood was making an American Western adaptation of his favorite film, he was desperate to be part of the project. But the casting process wasn't going smoothly for the role of Britt, the expert knife thrower. Director John Sturges had already offered the part to established actors Sterling Hayden and John Ireland, but both had turned it down for unknown reasons, leaving the production scrambling to find someone who could convincingly play the deadly and mysterious weapons expert. Fortunately for Coburn, his old friend and former classmate Robert Vaughn had already been cast in the film as Lee, and Vaughn knew about Coburn's passion for the original Japanese movie. When Vaughn learned how much trouble Sturges was having filling the Brit role, he recommended his friend for the part, knowing that Coburn's deep understanding of the source material would make him perfect for the character. The casting worked out beautifully because Coburn ended up playing the American version of the exact same character that had been his favorite in Seven Samurai, the quiet, deadly expert who proves his skill in an unforgettable demonstration scene that Sturges adapted directly from Kurosawa's original film. Fact 12. The theme became Marlboro's signature. Elmer Bernstein's iconic theme music from The Magnificent Seven was sold to Marlboro cigarettes in 1963 and became the instantly recognizable soundtrack to the famous Marlboro Man advertising campaign that ran for years on television and radio. The connection between the movie's heroic Western theme and cigarette advertising might seem strange today, but it made perfect sense to the advertising executives at the Leo Burnett Agency in Chicago, who were working to transform Marlboro from a women's cigarette into a masculine brand. The agency had already created the rugged cowboy character known as the Marlboro Man. But they needed music that would perfectly capture the spirit of the American West and the tough, independent lifestyle they were trying to sell. Bernstein's sweeping, heroic composition was exactly what they were looking for, because it instantly evoked images of wide-open ranges, brave cowboys, and the kind of masculine adventure that the Marlboro campaign wanted to associate with their product. The music had already proven its effectiveness in the movie, where it perfectly captured the heroism and determination of the seven gunfighters, so the advertisers knew it would have the same emotional impact in their commercials. Starting in 1963, the theme became the musical signature of Marlboro advertisements, playing in the background as real cowboys rode across scenic landscapes and performed authentic ranch work. The combination of the stirring music and the visual imagery of rugged men working in the American West was so powerful that it helped make Marlboro the best-selling cigarette brand in the world and turned Philip Morris into the largest tobacco manufacturer. The Marlboro campaign using Bernstein's music continued for about 8 years, until tobacco advertising was banned from television and radio in the early 1970s. During that time, millions of Americans became more familiar with the theme through cigarette commercials than through the actual movie, creating a strange situation where one of the most memorable film scores in history became better known as advertising music than as movie music. Fact 13. Akira Kurosawa sent a ceremonial sword. Akira Kurosawa sent director John Sturges a traditional Japanese ceremonial sword as a gift after seeing The Magnificent Seven, despite having publicly stated that the American adaptation was a disappointment and not a version of Seven Samurai. Kurosawa's reaction to the Hollywood remake of his masterpiece, Seven Samurai, was complicated and reflected the mixed feelings that many original creators have when their work is adapted by other filmmakers. On one hand, he was reportedly disappointed that the American version didn't capture the deeper philosophical and cultural elements that had made his original film so profound and meaningful. He felt that the Hollywood adaptation focused more on action and entertainment value rather than the careful character development and examination of honor, duty, and social responsibility that had been central to his story. However, Kurosawa was also a practical filmmaker who understood the challenges of adapting a 3.5-hour Japanese period drama into a 2-hour American Western, and he apparently recognized that Sturges had done a skillful job of translating the basic story structure and themes into a completely different cultural context. The fact that he took the time to watch the film and then went to the considerable effort of selecting and sending a ceremonial sword suggests that he had genuine respect for what Sturges had accomplished, even if it wasn't what he would have done himself. The ceremonial sword was a significant gesture in Japanese culture, representing honor, respect, and recognition of another warrior's skill and courage. By sending this traditional gift to Sturges, Kurosawa was essentially acknowledging him as a fellow filmmaker worthy of respect. Despite their different approaches to storytelling, the sword also symbolically connected the samurai warriors of his original film with the gunfighters of the American adaptation, suggesting that Kurosawa saw the deeper similarities between the two stories even while recognizing their surface differences. This gift became one of the most treasured possessions in Sturges' career, representing approval from one of the most respected directors in world cinema. Fact 14. Steve McQueen's deathbed reconciliation. In 1980, while Steve McQueen was dying of cancer, he made a phone call to Yul Brynner to thank him for not having him fired during their famous feud on The Magnificent Seven, telling Brynner that the film had made his career, and expressing gratitude for Brynner's professionalism during their difficult working relationship. The phone call came as a complete surprise to Brynner, who hadn't spoken to McQueen in years since their contentious time working together 20 years earlier. McQueen was battling terminal cancer and knew that his time was limited, which apparently motivated him to reach out and make peace with people from his past. When Brynner answered the phone and heard McQueen's voice, he was initially confused about why his former co-star was calling him after so many years of silence. McQueen's message was both simple and deeply emotional. He told Brynner, "You could have had me kicked off the movie when I rattled you, but you let me stay, and that picture made me, so thanks." This acknowledgement was particularly meaningful because it showed that McQueen finally understood how his behavior during filming had affected Brynner and recognized that Brynner had shown remarkable restraint in not using his star power to have McQueen removed from the production. Brynner's response was equally gracious and showed that he had gained perspective on their old rivalry over the years. He told McQueen, "I am the king and you are the rebel prince, every bit as royal and dangerous to cross." This poetic response suggested that Brynner had come to see their conflict as a clash between two strong personalities rather than a personal attack, and that he respected McQueen's talent even while acknowledging their difficult relationship. McQueen also said during the conversation, "I had to make it up with Yul because without him I wouldn't have been in that picture." This statement revealed that McQueen had spent years thinking about how The Magnificent Seven had changed his life and career trajectory, transforming him from a television actor into a major movie star. Fact 15. The film was a U.S. box office flop. The Magnificent Seven was considered a disappointing box office failure in the United States, earning only $2,250,000 against its $2 million production budget, which meant it barely broke even in its home country despite eventually becoming one of the most beloved Western films of all time. When The Magnificent Seven opened in American theaters on October 12, 1960, it was released in about 1,000 theaters across the South and Southwest regions of the United States. The initial response from American audiences was lukewarm at best, and the film struggled to find its audience during its domestic theatrical run. Critics gave the movie mixed reviews, with many comparing it unfavorably to Akira Kurosawa's original Seven Samurai, and finding it to be a simplified version of the Japanese masterpiece. The poor American box office performance was particularly frustrating for the producers and studio executives who had invested significant money in assembling the all-star cast and filming on location in Mexico. With such a slim profit margin in the domestic market, the film was in serious danger of being considered a commercial failure that would hurt the careers of everyone involved, including director John Sturges and the various actors who had fought so hard to be part of the project. However, the story completely changed when The Magnificent Seven was released in international markets, particularly in Europe. European audiences embraced the film with an enthusiasm that completely surprised the American distributors, and the movie became a massive hit across the continent. The overseas box office rentals eventually reached $7.5 million, which was almost 3 times more than the film had earned in the United States and Canada combined. This international success was so dramatic that it transformed The Magnificent Seven from a domestic disappointment into a profitable venture, with worldwide rentals totaling $9,750,000. The film was particularly successful in the Soviet Union, where it sold an astounding 67 million tickets, and became the highest-grossing Hollywood film ever released in that country.